Hi, everyone. We'll just wait a minute as people are coming into the room still, and we will get started momentarily. I do want to make sure that we use all of the time, though, or as much as possible, given that it's such an interesting discussion that we're about to have. Please note that it is being recorded, so we will be able to share this after if you've missed any components. Also, please note that it is being recorded and that we've set this up just to make sure we had no technical difficulties in a meeting style as opposed to a presentation style. So you would have the ability to take yourself off of mute, and so both your voice and then face could be seen and heard. So please keep that in mind. Additionally, please keep that in mind so that if there's anything background noise or anything going on, we can still pay attention and focus to the speakers. So for the time being until the question and answer period, if you could keep your mics muted and your cameras off, that would be greatly appreciated. With that said, just given that, as I said, we really want to maximize time today, I will head into the introductions and would invite both Carol and Phil to put their cameras on. And so welcome, everyone. I'm Ashley Casavan. I am the Executive Director of the Responsible AI Institute. I'm incredibly excited to be here today with two colleagues that I've had the pleasure of working with for, it seems like, several years now in the various different capacities that we've had. I will allow Carol and Phil to introduce themselves and share their interest in this topic in a moment. But just to let you know that we will then go into a question and answer period and between the panelists, and then we'll proceed to audience questions. I will be doing my best to monitor the chat, and so I will try and bring your questions into the discussion. But additionally, if there's questions that you have, please do let us know by raising your hand in that feature, and then we'll come to you. We'll leave about 10 minutes for that discussion. With that said, I would like to allow Carol to introduce herself and the work that she's doing, and then we can get into the information about the Canada AI Act.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's joined in the audience today. Really appreciate you joining, and thank you to Ashley for inviting me. It's always a pleasure to speak alongside you and Phil, two very well-respected experts in this field. So I appreciate that as well. My name's Carol Piovizan. I'm the managing partner at Inc. Law, where we focus on all aspects of data law. So privacy, cyber readiness, incident response, data governance, and increasingly AI risk management. We do this from a legal capacity as well as a consulting capacity, where we support readiness audits. Oops, I think someone's camera's on or mic is on. So we support readiness assessments, audits, impact assessments, and governance structures for companies across the board, including and especially those in highly regulated industries. With that, I will turn it over to Phil to make his introduction.
Sure. Thanks, Ashley, and thanks, Carol. It's Phil Dawson. I'm head of policy at Mill AI, which is a company that has developed a testing and validation platform for AI systems. Used for data scientists internally for testing, validation, internal audit, but also as a platform to support external assessments, audits, future certification schemes. And have a background as a lawyer, worked in private practice for a couple of years before, over the last 10 years or so, working in the emerging technology space in policy and standards development. I've also worked as a consultant with a number of different types of organizations, industry, but digital rights, advocacy organizations, research organizations, government, as well as some international organizations too. So I've been really privileged to work with many types of stakeholders engaged on the topic of AI and data governance, and yeah, really excited for this conversation about Canada's draft AI legislation, or the AI and Data Act. Thanks. Ashley, you're on mute.
Jeez. You would think that I would have resolved this already. I was following my own instructions too closely. Thank you so much for being here, both of you. I really do respect your opinions on this topic. I know that both of us individually or all of us individually and collectively have been really interested in the implications related to this act. But before we get into what the act is, what the scope is, I'd really like to really situate it in terms of thinking through what the overall intent is. I think that for most people on this call will know that there's some risks and potential implications that come from having a AI system be implicated, but Canada was one of the first governments, or was the first government in the world to have an AI strategy. Can you, Carol, start by positioning Canada's leadership in this space, and then what role the draft AI Act plays in that?
Sure. So listen, for the last, now going back to 2018, Canada has been a leader in AI, responsible AI policy. It has taken on different names. So we've talked about data ethics, we've talked about AI ethics, we've talked about ethical AI, and increasingly there's a period, we were talking about trustworthy AI, and increasingly we're talking more and more about responsible AI. And frankly, these words matter, because when we're talking about responsible AI, in a sense, we are looking at how we operationalize responsible action and accountability in the context of meaningful controls. So I really do like to think about it in terms of what the SOP, or standard operating procedure, will look like. Canada has led on the discourse around ethical AI. So a leader in putting together the Pan-Canadian strategy on artificial intelligence, investing quite a bit in research and development as well as commercialization, and then co-founding and organizing the global partnership on AI, in addition to different roles that Canada has played at the international and multilateral level. And Phil is much better placed to speak to that than I am. So you can see that from a policy perspective, Canada has really been out there. From a legal perspective, however, we have been a little bit slower in the sense that, the EU came out with its Artificial Intelligence Act in April 2021, and the US has followed in a number of different capacities with an Algorithmic Accountability Act back in 2019, retabled in 2022, as well as the Federal Data Privacy Act for the US, federal privacy law that incorporates elements of an algorithmic impact assessment. And that came out recently as well. That was February 2022. So Canada, coming to June 2022, finally tabled its reform for private sector privacy law, and at the same time tabled the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act that does situate Canada from a legal perspective, from a regulatory perspective, on par with some of the other major players and major markets around the world, where we have been leading traditionally on the policy side.
Thanks, Phil. Do you want to add?
Yeah, sure. I can see this is a really great compliment, to say the least, to some of the early initiatives that Canada has invested in through the first Pan-Canadian AI strategy, through the recent renewal in this past June. But as just yet one more measure to help focus both public and private sector investments into AI technologies that are quote, responsibly designed, developed, deployed. So now there has been training programs and in the earlier days workshops that CFAR conducted on AI and society. There's various programs at the National AI Institutes to support AI ethics research and training for applied research scientists. And now we have a piece of legislation that really is a framework for forthcoming regulations. that is going to further focus businesses' investment into technologies that are responsibly designed and deployed and operated. So, that's, I think, that's the Pan-Canadian strategy, and some of those investments, at least under that funding program, that's 5 years ago now. So, 5 years later, we have a piece of legislation, as Carol said. It's one of just a few that have been proposed globally, and yeah, I would see it as part of this continuum of efforts to stimulate research and commercialization of, call it, trustworthy or responsible AI technologies. And you can see some of the provisions of the Act, which we'll discuss in greater detail, are really aimed at cultivating that type of market.
Thank you so much. And I think that's really helpful, because often we start these dialogues with, these are the risks coming from AI systems. These are different types of use cases. We always go back to tried and true examples related to Amazon shutting down HR applications. But I think that helping to situate it in that political context with the different types of international efforts is quite important, and really recognizing the importance of opportunities related to AI and advancing Canada's leadership position, not just in terms of purporting our values out, but then the commercialization of it. And so I think that one of the things that we hear quite a bit, and I would guess that you do as well, but would love to hear your perspective on this, is if regulation hinders innovation and different types of opportunities. I think by situating it in what both of you just shared helps to articulate both the requirements to protect people, but then the opportunities for business to be able to kind of get ahead of that. Would love to know, just as we now turn to unpacking a little bit more about what the implications of this act actually are, how you kind of see that potential trade-off, and really thinking about what is the scope of this act, draft act, I should say, and what do you see the potential implications being? Some of the things, Carol, that you and I have talked about in the past on this topic. We had a quick take on it right after the day it came out, was really related to persons and the use of that term, things like geographical scope, as well as then different kind of terms in it, like confidential business or information. Would just love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure. So I'm happy to take a quick run at the framing of it. Something that's really important, in addition to what we have just been talking about, is the geopolitical nature of technology, and how data and technology are playing more and more into the hands of geopolitical forces. If we look at the US wanting to lead on standards, China came out with that first saying that they wanted to lead on standards and put together a national strategy on artificial intelligence, and projections as to the economic value of artificial intelligence well into the trillions. You can see that this is a technology, because of the way that it facilitates sort of more efficient uses. It sort of allows us to play to our strengths, to our highest value strengths, instead of doing more of the mundane type tasks. You have some of the current commercial uses that enable those tasks to be replaced. And then also looking forward to really what a connected and digital world looks like. It's very, on the one hand, very exciting, and there's a lot of great opportunity, and I don't want that to get lost. And on the other hand, it really does trigger some discussions around what our values look like, who are our friends, who will we be sharing information with, what does it look like to have a global world that is led or strongly augmented by artificial intelligence and computer systems, and what are the implications of that? So there is a really important geopolitical component to what we're talking about when you think about the role of law and what the law is trying to do and what the law is trying to protect. Getting to that second point of what this law is trying to do, it's very clearly defining the scope of implication related to high impact systems. And that's a really important term that I want the audience to pay attention to, because in fact, it is the very trigger of what gets you into the confines of the law. High impact AI system has not yet been defined. It is provided as a definition in the regulation, but it said, or sorry, in the draft law, but it says that it will be further defined in the regulation. And so the two-part test just to enter the AIDA is first to make sure that your system does fall within the definition of artificial intelligence, which is provided in the draft law, and then to determine whether or not it fits within the definition of a high-impact system. And if so, then there are a series of positive obligations on persons responsible for the use or making available or development of these systems that do ultimately trigger significant government oversight. So just pausing on the notion of the oversight for a moment, we have here written into the law various ministerial orders or through a delegate, which is the Artificial Intelligence and Data Commissioner, that there can be a series of audit requirements to look at different documentation, which those who are responsible for these systems are required to keep and make, or make and keep. In the very sort of the farthest end of the spectrum when it comes to oversight, a requirement to cease operating certain systems that have imminent significant harm. So you can see that in this context of competitiveness, where the law is trying to facilitate and enable, to an extent, the creation and making available of artificial intelligence systems, where there is a decision that it is high impact, meaning that, and this is again defined in the law, there is, a high risk around harm, which is defined, or output bias, which is also defined, that the law is trying to create accountability structures put in place. So the question then, and I'll end after this, is to what extent does this hinder or in some way augment or support innovation? And I think the real honest answer to that will come. I don't think we know yet, because there is still a lot that needs to be defined in the regulation vis-a-vis this act. So we need to better understand what specifically the act is protecting. But as a default position, regulation does not necessarily hinder innovation. In many cases, particularly in regulated sectors that are more at risk or that operate in a higher risk environment, having these guardrails in place or these requirements is not necessarily a hindrance to innovation, but establishes the playing field and the rules of engagement to start to participate. So I would not say as a default position that it is a hindrance. In fact, it could very much liberate innovation. The question will be, what did the details show us? And when the regulations come out, how specifically, how prescriptive will we be around how we regulate these systems?
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think that's my position on it as well. But I do really want to highlight one of the things that you had talked about in terms of the scope being those standards and certifications and audits. That's something that Phil and I, for obvious reasons, for those that know me well, know that is important to be able to talk about. And I think one of the opportunities that comes, and Phil would love to get your point on this, with standards complementing this draft act would be to have those common requirements so that businesses aren't left guessing what does good look like, or everybody having their own best practices, which kind of seeks to mitigate some of those challenges related to regulation being too much or hindering that innovation. Would love to get your thoughts on that.
Sure, and Carol, I really enjoyed your comments. I want to build on it just a little bit, in that I think this act has the potential to really incentivize a lot of innovation, and in some ways that as a consequence of the way this emerging regulatory framework has been designed, first with a high-level framework and legislation, then with some regulations to come, and then whether and how they'll reference or incorporate standards and conformity assessments as vehicles to support compliance. And what I mean by that is this: if you look at one of the baseline obligation, let's call it, for a person who's responsible for a high impact system, it is to identify, assess, and mitigate risks of harm and biased output. This is not, there's no prescription to businesses on how to do this. And hopefully that will open up a lot of innovative solutions, and it already has, by the way, that will help make that will help operationalize this in practice. So, businesses internally, and I'm talking about especially large enterprises that are in some of the sectors that are already adopting artificial intelligence at scale. If we're thinking of financial services, for instance, or maybe AI in recruitment or in healthcare. A lot of these sectors, businesses have already started using different types of technical tools to assess bias, to detect bias, to monitor the performance of AI systems. Armilla AI, the company that I work for, has a platform to test and validate AI systems and to improve the quality of these systems and ensure that when at deployment that risk has been mitigated. So these types of tools are being developed by internal teams. They're being procured by third-party vendors. And there's a whole kind of industry that has emerged in the last several years in response to businesses' perception that there's a commercial need to do this, to deploy AI systems faster, to get them through the testing and validation phase faster. They need to adopt technical tools. And then this is directly going to go towards compliance as well. So I think the fact that this piece of legislation has not been prescriptive, and it says, business, here's a strong message. You're going to have to adopt measures to assess and mitigate risk of harms and bias. We're not telling you exactly how you have to do this yet, but there's an opportunity to kind of showcase what some of these technical solutions are. Many businesses are already innovating internally on how to do this. A whole crop of startups has emerged to supply these types of solutions. So, is regulation going to stifle innovation? Stifle or harm innovation? I don't think so. Is it going to channel resources a little bit differently? Absolutely. But I think the result is going to be hopefully a market and an ecosystem where these compliance technologies or assurance technologies. I'm also the policy lead at the Schwartz-Reason Institute. We call them regulatory technologies. A whole market of these types of tools is going to continue to emerge, and it's going to be incentivized by pieces of legislation like this. And of course, as we see regulations emerge, if and when this act is adopted and the scope of regulations required to operationalize this piece of legislation is clarified, then I think it'll only support the development of some of these innovative technical solutions that will actually help businesses deploy AI systems, trustworthy AI systems, faster and have a shorter time to market. And I'll just add one more comment related to the geopolitical environment. But that's something that's actually being looked at very intently in the EU. They have launched or they've directly in the legislation there is a requirement for member states to launch regulatory sandboxes to test different provisions of the EU AI Act, which will likely support the emergence of technical solutions that enable compliance. The UK, which hasn't come out with a piece of legislation yet, has started mapping what this type of AI assurance ecosystem should look like, so that businesses actually have tools to be able to comply with any future regulation should it be adopted. And the UK has signaled that they'll likely have a white paper on their approach to regulation later this year. I think we should expect to see that any regulation coming out of the UK will be used to incentivize the development of this market of compliance technologies and services.
Ashley, can I just add one quick point to that?
Yeah.
Because there's the legal lens to all of this, and then there's a very practical lens, which is systems are being developed and being deployed and used in all sorts of different sectors. And some are being constructed, I don't know if constructed is the right word, but developed in a manner that is much more accountable, and others aren't. And with the passage of, if the EU Act is to pass, then regardless, frankly, of whether Canada or the US necessarily passes legislation, we can already see that there will be a significant compliance obligation in order just to enter the EU market. So for those businesses that have not yet started to operationalize what that responsible AI framework should look like, both from a people process perspective as well as from a technical perspective, they're going to be facing some pretty serious implications of having to go back and in some cases reinstitute or re-engineer, not from a technical perspective, some of their processes to make them compliant. So the fact that we already know now what we can anticipate the world is worried about, and we can see what the different requirements may look like in order to play fair, is from a practical point of view what should be the guiding sort of North Star for companies that are either developing these systems or are using them in high risk, high impact type scenarios, most of which you've got guidance from the EU in terms of their criticality of risk, or frankly, sometimes, and this is not my legal interpretation, but you can use your spidey sense and just get a sense of how risky does this feel, and then we can go through a bigger analysis. But I want to make this, because the law can make it very complicated and very esoteric, but there's also a really practical lens, which is you don't want to find yourself 5 years from now having to comply with law that was in draft form 5 years earlier.
Yeah, no, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I think that there's a lot of questions around many aspects of this, high risk, high impact being one of them. What does that mean? What's in, what's out? Yes, your legal interpretation is like, sometimes we just know that's like not great. I remember a long time ago, there was the Bank of Canada did something. Anyway, I was at this webinar and they were like, does this seem creepy or not creepy? It's like, so yes, we have a sense of these things. That said, I think what's particularly interesting also about the draft act is that it is situated with consumer protection and data protection as well. Carol, I know that you've done webinars on the different aspects of it, but that people should probably go and watch in more detail. But just would love to get both of your thoughts because we've talked a little bit about what the scope is of that particular section. I can't help but think through when you're talking about your answers, even things like privacy. There's already CCPA and other CPPA, sorry. Anyway, I get my acronyms confused all the time, but that do actually speak to those data protections that need to exist. But even just on, you're talking about this in terms of this almost being like good business practices to have viable commercial options for AI systems. That comes along with building a system following good best practices like data architecture, enterprise architecture. And so just wondering how you see that being unique to Canada's positioning of this.
Yeah, so I'm very happy to take that on. And I see that Mark Etienne has his hand up as well, so we can turn to that next. Listen, I think the point around this law and the general measures that are found within the law are consistent in terms of process. So we are looking at the articulation of what is the intended use of this system. How have you defined risk and impact? What are the various measures that you've put in place to mitigate risk and impact? What type of disclosure is due to the public or due to your regulator in order to provide sort of fair notice of what's happening? And all of these different provisions that are sort of said in different ways across the different pieces of legislation, but you find consistent in terms of process. And I'm not trying to minimize, I'm just trying to make all of this feel a little bit more tangible. But all of these different requirements are around ensuring that the life cycle approach that's adopted with the AI system, from ideation through to operationalization and beyond, are thoughtful. So that if you look, I've had the pleasure of going through this exercise of looking at the different laws across different jurisdictions and the leading frameworks and some of the leading academic articles, and putting together what I think is, you know, the most comprehensive list of requirements according to phases. And it was about 15 slides of like smaller font, 2 tables per slide. So you're looking at dozens of different requirements. That's not going to be realistic. So instead, what I think we need to do, and of course, this will come to bear when we see what actual laws pass, but take into mind or take into consideration the fact that we're looking at the life cycle approach, the fact that we are worried about long-term implications as well as short-term impact, the fact that we're worried about elements of harm and bias, the misuse of systems, and then the unintentional sort of harmful outputs. And then the fact that we are trying to do what we do in the world of privacy law as well, which is equip those on the end user side with some degree of knowledge and control over how they interact with or participate in or are affected by these systems. So, you know, when I do that and I think really practically about this, which I try to do often, I focus on some of those positive obligations that you find in the AIDA under the requirements section. And I really try to break down how you operationalize that throughout the life cycle of the AI system. And then super importantly, how do you document it? Because you can do it, but if you didn't document it, you didn't do it. So you have to document it and be able to demonstrate that in fact you have lived up to those obligations. I don't know if Phil, you want to add something and then we turn over to Mark Etienne, or how you want to run that.
Oh, let's go to Mark Etienne as a question. I've seen his hand up for a little bit now. If he's still there.
Hey friends, yeah, sorry, I am driving, so I apologize if there is some extra noise, and if it's too noisy, by all means, just cut me off. I just wanted to, and I apologize, I missed the first 10 minutes as I was trying to connect, so if you've already kind of touched upon this, again, cut me off. But I wanted to maybe play devil's advocate a bit and kind of push back against the idea that this bill is kind of innovation friendly, as opposed to kind of you know, squashing innovation approaches. I think it is innovation friendly in the sense of pushing the creation of a regulatory market around how people go about complying. But I think, considering the fact that it has even criminal consequences for actions that have yet to be defined, both in, as we all know, kind of the lack of any type of standards that are really properly approved. Even the standards that are currently in development, like 42001 or NIST management framework, are extremely high level, which then leaves it to companies, legal departments, to assess what they consider to be proper compliance, without even mentioning the differentiation between developers and deployers. So like, what is the responsibility of a developer versus that of a deployer, ultimately, of the technology? And I think in the circumstances where Canada is a growing laggard with regards to AI adoption, and I wrote a paper in Policy Options a few weeks back, there's footnotes in there that I can't remember by heart, but that, yeah, I believe Tortoise and Deloitte and a few others have measured that Canada's rate of adoption is abysmal compared to other countries. I think customers or those types of traditional industries that aren't specific AI players, who are considering whether or not they should be deploying AI, by all means should be asking themselves if they're doing so responsibly. But now getting the signal, we don't know what compliance means. We have no precision as to whether we are compliant or not, but we may face criminal repercussions and up to 4% of total turnover as a consequence of that. So I think that is highly troubling, essentially. Like that, I think that any understanding that this would be filled by a regulatory market that has yet to find any of those solutions. I think we should try to look to have those solutions before we impose consequences of that level. Anyways,
Yeah.
that's a general comment.
Yeah, no, Mark-Etienne, I think that's really helpful, and obviously something that we're concerned about and thinking through standards and certification. So maybe Phil, I'll go to you
Sure.
to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, there is. I want to highlight for everybody listening. I think one of the provisions that Mark is talking about, Section 39, is potentially, very broad scope for sanctions against for number of harms. I actually just have the provision here, but really, if you're deploying without lawful excuse or knowing that, or reckless as to whether a system is likely to cause serious physical, psychological harm, etc. There could be some significant penalties, and the Act also contains other instances where there are offenses that have significant penalties. And at the same time, there are no regulations yet. Standards have not been published yet. And there is a challenge for businesses to know exactly what they should be doing. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how the government moves through, well, first, a consideration of the Act itself, but the timing of the rollout of regulations to provide that type of guidance to businesses. Can understand how some of the ambiguity raises a lot of questions for businesses. I do think, and I hope that we see this from the government, that there's an opportunity to co-develop, not just with industry, but with other stakeholders too, as this act is if and when it is adopted, and as the regulations are being developed. I think there's a huge opportunity for co-development with stakeholders, and some of the things I mentioned earlier about sandboxes and pilots as ways to test what is feasible for businesses to comply with, and also strikes the right balance of protecting the public. These will be some key challenges for the government for sure. For the time being,
if I could just give like a really like crisp example that's like in the news right now. Like you might have seen this new large language model that encompasses, I think, 48 different languages and dialects. That's essentially like a GPT-3 like model, but that will function with things like even French Canadian or Portuguese or other languages that often are not made available by these types of mega models. This is overall a huge win, right? It's difficult. It's a direct objective, for instance, of the government of Canada, the government of Quebec, through the Global Partnership on AI, to try to ensure that you have language representation in the development of models like that. So huge positive. They're making it largely open source and available to any developers who want to use that model as a baseline to then develop applications. I can 100% guarantee that the developers of that large model cannot control whether ultimately a deployer will then take that model and tweak it in such a way when deploying it in Quebec that it will not have biased outcomes, right? And so that model, if I'm the legal counsel for that model that's being made publicly available, I'm hyper concerned because I don't have the ability to control whether those ultimate deployers are going to be able to handle kind of every circumstance under which it might roll out, and whether or not I'll have criminal repercussions for an act like that. So
Yeah,
I think those aren't tedious questions. Like, these are real reasons that are going to make people take pause before they really try to deploy these types of innovative applications.
Yeah, Mark-Etienne, will have to invite you as a panelist on our next webinar. But
I apologize for talking so much.
No.
I'll concentrate on driving.
Can I add 2 points to that?
Yeah, can I just ask? I'm going to ask a question. I'm the moderator, so I can do such things. But I kind of want to tie Mark-Etienne's comments to that related. And Carol, maybe this is where you're going anyway. But back to something that you touched on earlier related to the implications of this being on persons. And we see in the draft EU AI Act, and there's lots of questions related in the chat related to the need for harmonization of these and what those different implications will be if you're operating in multiple markets. And so the draft EU AI Act talks about product owner, and I think Mark Etienne's comments kind of getting to those implications. So just if you could kind of respond to how it's drafted. I know, Phil, you talked about this is in draft, so where it's going with this, and that there'll be considerable work that's done to understand a bit better, but additionally, that there's regulations that are coming from that. Would love to have your views on that as well. But Carol, go ahead.
So I just wanted to touch on the point of the penalties. There are two really interesting penalties in the AIDA. The first is under Section 29, which is the administrative monetary penalties. And those come for non-compliance with your AI program. For all intents and purposes, I'll call it the AI management program. So that, what is interesting in my view, is that it expressly says that if there is a violation of those systems, you may be subject to AMPs, but the AMPs are not intended to be punitive, which I find interesting because typically penalties are punitive. But in this case, they're being explicit that the intention is not to be punitive. In fact, my guess is it's just to be restorative, that you go back to proper, compliance. When it comes to the criminal charges, I think these are drafted in a way to make them quite restrictive. So you're looking at something, 38 references, specific intent to do something that is harmful without lawful excuse, or where you're reckless. So in the example you gave, Mark Etienne, what would be reckless is if you give out that system to all sorts of, players that you haven't done any diligence with, and without any proper contract that establishes what the intended use is, what the limitations of the systems are, who bears liability for misuse, and so on and so forth. So I think there is a reasonable system that you put in place to limit your own liability as a developer. And here I'm not giving anybody legal advice, but just from my own assessment, there are reasonable limits that you can put in place that would certainly support not at least a very defensible argument against a large fine, certainly against a term of imprisonment, where you would be really looking for something that is, I would argue, grossly reckless and negligent, that would cause significant harm, or something that is intentional to cause harm. So I just wanted to add that, although I think it is a very fair point, that there can be some, a chilling effect on innovation. At the same time, it may just require those businesses to put in place those appropriate structures and the appropriate contracts. It's not business as usual. Don't pull out your old master service agreement and throw it forward. It's not going to be good enough. So really think about what are the longer term implications, and frankly, think supply chain. Who are you selling to? Who did you get it from? How does the entire world of your system operate? And have you been thoughtful and diligent in that process? So I'll raise that. In terms of, the harmonization of different laws and the interpretation of responsible person, I have to say, in looking at the definition of person responsible again, it's actually broader than I initially realized. So the definition itself contemplates someone who is responsible for AI systems, including high impact AI systems, meaning that you may be responsible for something that actually is not caught by this legislation. So I think the intention is to distribute that kind of responsibility ultimately across the entire supply chain to an extent, but then really trying to, again, put in place the right structures to try to establish liability throughout your entire throughout all of your various relationships. So I'll sort of flag that as something to pay attention to and as a consideration, as well as the regulated activity definition that makes a distinction between processing or making available for use. So different levels of action or activity required in order to trigger that definition.
Great, thanks. Phil, do you want to add to that?
Maybe just a short comment to say that I think this is a key distinction that Mark has pointed out between one of the approaches taken in the AI and Data Act and some analogous features of the EU AI Act, which tried to create more specificity around the roles and obligations of developers and end users. But with respect to some of the large language models or general purpose systems that Mark is describing, frankly, the feedback from the business community was also that this was just not precise enough. So either you get to an extremely precise piece of legislation, so it's crystal clear, but maybe less future-proof and less resilient, or you take a different approach, which I think is the one put forward in the AI and Data Act, to say that, as Carol defined, we have this person responsible for an AI system across the supply chain of actors, and each of them will be responsible for assessment and mitigation at each juncture. If you read section 6 through 10 of the Act, it's pretty clear that some of this will also depend upon the documentation that is created by a developer, let's say for one of these general purpose transformer models, about what the system has been developed, tested, and evaluated for. And then, yeah, of course, there will be some contractual work between transacting parties around exactly what this type of a system is going to do. So I'll have to say, how much specificity do you want to put into a piece of legislation? For sure, there's a broad spectrum. At the end of the day, there is going to be there's still going to be some contractual work to do. But it's a great point, and we'll see. It's one of the things I'm really keen to better understand as the government begins to consult on this, and the topic of regulations that'll help operationalize the Act emerges.
Yeah, and Carol, this is something that you and I have talked about a bit in terms of how do you have that balance between principle-based legislation and then really prescriptive legislation. I think that the perspective we have is really trying to understand how standards and certifications can help to augment that common understanding of what does good look like. The work that, Phil, you're doing within Armilla and other kind of testing and evaluation organizations are thinking about is how do we do that in a modernized way that allows for that ongoing monitoring to be able to satisfy not only that log of documentation requirements, but also being able to demonstrate that the system was tested for bias or that there's aspects of explainability. Carol, I don't know if you want to add anything additional to that, since I know you have views on that balance.
I mean, if you look at our privacy law, it's principle based, and that's been something that has been very effective for us in the last 25 years that it's been around. And now we're, potentially going to adopt something that is a little more prescriptive, but it still allows for a degree of flexibility in terms of how that law is operationalized or ultimately enforced. Phil made the point earlier, which I think is really important, which is, this is the draft AIDA gives the skeleton of what compliance would look like in Canada. And then we're looking to regulation to help put meat on those bones. And the regulation does allow for a slightly more agile process, or at least arguably it does. So looking to effective guidance, standards, certifications, regulation that allows for these different components to be included is very helpful. It's not only helpful, frankly, for guidance in terms of what you as an organization that has this law apply to it does, but ultimately it's also going to be helpful for adjudicating disputes between parties. So this is where we get into, a whole other layer of complexity when it comes to the law, and where I think we will see a role, a lot put on companies to do the right thing and establish the right protections in place through their contracts, be much more prescriptive about what the intended use is, what the parameters are around that system, if they are the ones that are creating and deploying that system or developing the system and then ultimately selling it off or licensing it. that there will be clear, you'll want to put in place some pretty clear parameters. And then you will want to have those obligations around monitoring, controlling clearly articulated. Who's going to be doing that? And what happens if something is not operating as intended? Who becomes responsible for responding to that? We see elements of that already, again, from a process flow in the privacy legislation. So we've got those muscles that we can start to build from privacy law that we can bring into the world of AI risk management more effectively. I really think that the structure we have right now in the AIDA, it's not perfect, but it's actually pretty good. I think it gives enough clarity without being overly prescriptive, and then it allows for greater consultation around not only what the skeleton should look like, but what should the meat look like in the regulation. And I can already anticipate some of the areas that will be consulted upon, but I think and potentially tweaked. But I really do think this is a pretty good starting point.
Thanks so much. And Carol, I really appreciate your effort to try and make something that's really complex and complicated, but also very newsworthy. And so therefore people have, as we know, a lot of inherent lack of trust around the use of these systems, so tangible and practical. So appreciate that for sure. On that note, one of the questions that we have in the chat, I'll just transition over to audience question now. If you want to put them in the chat, I can relay them to the panelists. But Yuhan's asking around if it's up to the organization to define what high impact AI system means. And so maybe if you can kind of speak in that plain language around what those implications are, and if we even know that yet.
I think no. I think the high impact system will be defined in the regulation. That's what it says. And then to better answer that question, we'll just have to see what the regulation says. Phil, I don't know what your take on that is.
I'm just checking something because I have it open, but that's absolutely true. The impact assessment to determine whether or not a system may be classified as high impact will be defined in regulation. So I'll be keen to see what that looks like. We know that the EU has kind of pursued an approach where in the Annex 3 they have a list of so-called high risk systems. Is that something that the Canadian government is going to pursue, or is there going to be maybe something like an impact assessment methodology, so that keeping the spirit of the Act as we've seen it so far, it would be incumbent on the person responsible to follow this methodology for assessing whether or not their system is a high impact or not, and making a judgment call about whether or not they feel as though they fall into this category. And then all the obligations associated with being a person responsible for a high impact system flow, and if they don't, if they take a risk and say, not sure, not going to follow all these obligations, well, then they really open themselves up to some serious liability if something
I agree.
goes wrong. So I think we will see in regulation, and if you look at sections 36 of the Act, section 36 and 37, it lists at least some of the regulations that will be required to operationalize the Act. I think 36B, it says establishing criteria for the purpose of the definition high impact system. So to be determined.
The one thing we do know is that it has to be artificial intelligence, because that's in the definition, and that in and of itself has a definition that's multi-part. So you should read that carefully.
Yes, I think that's helpful. And one of the things, Carol, that you raised, and I think this goes back to, again, some of the topics we talked about earlier related to this scope. And so another question's in the chat, just to get ready for that. Related to that is how, I think an open question would be how this relates to other types of laws where there's already requirements in privacy legislation related to doing an algorithmic impact assessment. And so it'll be really interesting to see how that kind of shapes up. And how one of the things that I've been really interested in is how are existing regulations like E23 requiring model risk management for systems within a banking context really apply in this, and how do those align with one another? So I think that we're here to provide information on kind of what we know currently, but there's more to come. And I think that sessions like this also allow us to have a dialogue in terms of understanding what some of the key concerns are, but also where we can all advocate collectively for additional clarification. So with that, I think, again, we've kind of touched on this briefly, but it would be useful to go back. There's a question related to the use of the word interprovincial activity. And so just for time purposes, I'll let you speak to that. Carol, go ahead. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay.
Yes,
so,
yeah.
That we find that in PIPEDA as well, that type of language, as I recall. So it's really to distinguish, I think, between federal and provincial jurisdiction. So we're looking at the way I've interpreted it, and I understand it's like broadly interpreted, is that if there's something that is only happening, a system that is made available or used only within or developed only within one jurisdiction and not, so Ontario, for instance, just to be clear, and it's not happening across provincial or international lines, then arguably this law would not apply if it were to pass. What is the likelihood of that being the case? Don't think that's really going to be very likely, not impossible, but probably unlikely. And then otherwise, it's a way to have sort of federal, provincial jurisdictions clarified.
Right, thank you. Phil, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, I'll just say that I think take the case of a business that intends to develop and sell only in the within the province of Ontario. That may be a one-off client engagement, but likely any business in Ontario is really aiming to sell across Canada and globally. So even for that one system that ends up being developed and deployed just within one province, any business is likely going to want to develop that in the same way as products it will be developed in the same way that they want to develop products that are being sold on the global market. So I think even if in the law it appears as though those systems are not captured, I think in practice they will be.
Great. Thanks to both of you. One last question to close this out is, if there's one thing that everyone on this webinar can take with them, whether they're representing themselves, their companies, what is a good next step in action as we wait for more of this to be fleshed out?
I'm happy to
start.
Okay. No, Phil, go ahead.
Okay. So I would say it's still early days for this piece of legislation. At the same time, that gives quite a bit of lead time as this act will be debated, potentially adopted, and then regulations come. It gives a lot of lead time to begin thinking about AI governance within an enterprise or even a small business. And as much on the types of policies and procedures you need to put into place to be able to identify, assess, mitigate the risk of harm and biased outputs, that main obligation if you're deploying a high impact system or a person responsible for a high impact system. So you can already begin today thinking about some of the higher level organizational governance that you need to put into place, similar to the privacy management systems that are contemplated under privacy legislation in Canada. AI management systems might be very helpful for your business to begin considering. The Standards Council of Canada is currently piloting an AI management system standard by ISO, and really foreshadowing, I think, some of the best practices that businesses will have to implement. And then I would also add, begin to think about how you're going to either develop in-house or seek third-party solutions for assessing AI models. This is not something that can be done manually alone. There's technological solutions out there that exist for testing, to support testing, validation, assessment and mitigation of risk. Some businesses are doing these internally, and of course there are third parties that can help with this. All of these will kind of make up the package of policies, procedures, and tools that will make compliance possible. And even as the Act and regulations are developed in an iterative fashion, you can begin to do this. The second thing I'll say, and I'll pass to Carol because I know we're running out of time, is that I've encouraged businesses to participate in and seek out opportunities to speak with the government about plans for the Act and forthcoming regulations. Because as I said before, these can only be shaped by practice. So first, get prepared, but also be ready to meet with folks from the government and to help inform these processes.
Perfect. Thanks, Carol. I know we're running out of time, so go ahead.
I'll be super quick. I say you don't need to wait for regulation to pass. You don't need the law now to tell you exactly what to do. We already know what systems you need to put in place and what are we protecting against. So establishing that framework, establishing that life cycle diligence framework around responsible AI is extremely doable right now, and actually a very good idea. So you don't find yourself trying to do retrospective compliance in the world of AI. It won't work.
And it's going to take a ton of time to do. So, and I would just like to add to Phil's comment, the Responsible AI Institute is also part of that pilot with Standards Council of Canada, looking at how ISO AIMS is applied and really thinking about that in the specific context for what does good look like for AI systems specifically, as per that earlier conversation we had. I just put up here ways to stay in touch with all of us or with us, and then helpful to get you connected. We can help you get connected to Phil and Carol as well. So on that, I just want to say a huge thank you to both of you for participating and joining in this discussion. I know that we covered a lot of ground, but there's still a lot more to be able to unpack with this. So thank you so much for being here, and hopefully we can continue this conversation in a variety of different formats in the coming months and probably years as we start to understand what it's going to look like, and then also what those implications are. Thank you so much to everybody for participating, and we'll see you again on our next webinar.